Okay, we got geometry notes 6.5. Today's objective, to determine if a parallelogram is a rhombus, rectangle, or square. Keep in mind this little figure up here means parallelogram that I have up on the board here that I'm pointing to. Okay, now what we're going to be reviewing and kind of going over, rhombuses, perpendicular diagonals. And diagonals bisect each other, or each angle they come to, and the sides are congruent in a rhombus. In a rectangle, the diagonals are always congruent. And by the way, a rectangle, basic definition, all four angles are right angles inside. A square is a rhombus rectangle. So a square has to have diagonals perpendicular and the diagonals all be congruent. A square's sides are congruent, but has to have all right angles, okay, and able to be a square. So we're looking at this, our objective again, to determine if a parallelogram is a rhombus, rectangle, or square. So our first property we're working with today is looking at 6.16. If the diagonals of a parallelogram are perpendicular, then the parallelogram is a rhombus. So if I know it's a parallelogram already, and then you find out, hey, them diagonals, they're perpendicular, then I can say, hey, it's a rhombus. I know that for a fact, Jack. Okay, so if ABCD is a parallelogram, that's that little shape means is parallelogram. And segment AC is perpendicular to segment BC, the diagonals bisect, then ABCD is a rhombus. Now, keep in mind, I've said that property 4 times now. I'm going to ask you to reread these 3 properties after we're done so you can answer questions 1A and 1B. Now, in theorem 6.17, another property. If one diagonal of a parallelogram bisects a pair of opposite angles, notice how this is, one diagonal. Now that's all I have to do. If I know it's a parallelogram, only one diagonal is needed to bisect the opposite angles it comes from, or goes to, I should say. Then the parallelogram is a rhombus. So if I know that ABCD is a parallelogram, and angle 1 and 2 are congruent, and 3 and 4 are also congruent, then I know it's a rhombus. Okay, and incidentally, since opposite angles in a parallelogram are congruent, not only 1 and 2 equal to each other and 3 and 4 are equal to each other, but they're all equal to each other because opposite angles are the same value. And half the same is still the same. So we got to keep that in mind too, because that's playing in our heads. Now, theorem 6.8. If the diagonals of a parallelogram are congruent diagonals, hey, then the parallelogram is a rectangle. Again, we have that parallelogram little picture, that shortcut. If ABCD is a parallelogram and segment AC is congruent to segment BD, then ABCD is a rectangle. Now, keep in mind, segment AC and segment BD are diagonals. Diagonals being the same. Another sneaky little way they're going to tell you that the diagonals are the same without even saying a word. In a parallelogram, the diagonals bisect each other. If all the diagonals are bisected evenly, they have to be the same length, because half of the same is still the same. Weird, he's used that twice already. Half of the same is still the same. So keep that in mind. That's another way to say the diagonals have been bisected and they're equal to each other without even saying a word. But that's not part of this property, so I'm going to pull those out. Okay. Now, what I need you to do is we just spent 3 minutes and 50 seconds going over 3 properties. I want you to spend the next minute rereading them. Go ahead. Now, after you reread, look at problems 1A and 1B. Can you conclude that the parallelogram, is a rhombus, rectangle, or a square? If so, explain. So I've got a diagonal In a parallelogram, one diagonal, splitting the two angles it's coming to into two equal parts. What do I know about this shape? Is it a square, a rhombus, or a rectangle? Read 6.17 above. Yeah, it should be a rhombus, based on just that theorem. Should be a rhombus. That's all it is. Now in B, notice I kind of gave you a hint to this one. I have diagonals bisecting each other because it's a parallelogram. But with those markings, they're all the same. And then the diagonals are perpendicular to each other. So what do we know? Half of the same is the same, so it's a rectangle. But diagonals are perpendicular, that makes it a rhombus. But a rhombus rectangle really is a square, okay? And because I have a bunch of properties coming together here, I'm listing them. Yes, I can determine what's going on here. Diagonals are mutual bisectors of each other. Okay, they've been equally split. Diagonals are congruent. Well, congruent diagonals is a rectangle. Diagonals are perpendicular. Perpendicular diagonals are a rhombus. So a rectangular rhombus is a square. Okay? So that's how we come to this final conclusion. It's a square. That's how we came to that one being a rhombus. Now on this last one, a parallelogram has angle measures of 20, 160, 20, and 160. Okay, well it makes kind of sense because the angles opposite each other are always the same in a parallelogram. So opposites are 20s, opposites are 160. Did they tell me that the sides are all the same in the words in the problem? And they're asking me to make the picture, so it's not a rhombus. They didn't tell me all the sides are the same, or they didn't at least guarantee that all of them. It could be, but they didn't give me that information. They didn't tell me that the diagonals are perpendicular, so again, it can't be a rhombus. I know it definitely can't be a square, and it definitely cannot be a rectangle. Why not? Yeah, not all the angles are the same. They all have to be 90 interiors for a rectangle or a square, so that right out the window for those two. So right now we know this, and I should say just a parallelogram with the information provided. That's all I can say about this. It's a parallelogram. Now, if they give me more information, something about my sides, something about diagonals bisecting, something about the side lengths somehow, whatever, maybe I can come up with a different conclusion. But right now, that parallelogram is just the parallelogram. Okay, now, please, keep in mind, I have people that when I go over notes or when I just walk by their notes, they say, yeah, for A, yeah, rhombus, and B, yeah, square, and C, not at all. But they don't have a justification for the words or the properties that we use to come to our conclusions. And that's really what notes are about. When you guys read your notes, you reread your notes, you're going over the properties, you're actually like exercising the understanding of what's happening in each section. And if you don't have it completely dressed out, you're not getting the whole picture when you're doing your review. Okay? I assume that you are. And people go, my notes don't tell me nothing. I was like, well, probably because you ain't writing nothing on them. Okay? Make sure you write stuff on notes. If you have questions about them, and you should, make sure you follow up with questions. Okay, write them in the margins and then come back to me about it. But you should be rereading your notes today. Your assignment today, along with the time that you're given in class, you should be able to finish your assignment, reread your notes 2 or 3 times, okay, and be able to ask follow-up questions on stuff you don't have to come back here for because you're provided the time today in class. So make sure you're using that and you're being wise about that because, hey, man, all the new material, 4 days of new material. We got a couple days of review next week, and then we got a test. Okay, and I also got a quiz next week too. Now, here it is. I got 4 questions left. Based on the stuff we've done already, answer A and C first. Let's do A and C first. A and C, and then we'll do B and D. Do A and C first, because let's just stay with the shape. Okay, so based on the information we've already got, we should know that when I see a parallelogram cut by a diagonal, and I'm looking to see, hey, if it's going to be a rhombus, that diagonal has got to cut that angle it comes to into two equal parts. So they've got to be equal to each other. So I should be setting those equal and getting it done. Okay, are you okay with what I did? I got a lot of head bobbles. Okay, it's going well. Rhombuses, what do we know about rhombuses? What's the way they're defined when we first came about them? Do you remember that all the sides are the same? So if I have two consecutive sides or opposite sides, doesn't matter because in a rhombus they're the same. So I set them equal. Okay, so go ahead and get your solve on here. So now I'm getting this, subtract 3x, 9 equals 5x minus 1, 10 equals 5x, and x is 2. Are you okay with that? Now, we talked about rectangles. Rectangles, the diagonals bisect each other, but they're also the same length. So half of the same is still the same. Half of the same is still the same. So I've got 5y plus 3 is equal to 7y minus 5. That's the setup. But part of this half of the same is still the same sets up a special type of triangle too. What type of triangle is that? Isosceles. How do you know that? Two sides of the same. Fantastic. What's the follow-up piece of information you know about those base angles now? Do you recall? Base angles are congruent. That's a little messed up, but now I'm recalling stuff from chapter 5, chapter 4, the isosceles triangle stuff when we start working with this diagonals bisecting to find angle value now too. Okay? So keep that in mind. Now that stuff is in play as we go through these. Go ahead, do B, do D. So now I've got those set up. Are you okay with 4 is equal to y? And then my last one, same type. So I'm getting after this, and I've got my x is 3. Are we doing okay? Now, keep in mind that last property that I talked about, base angles of an isosceles triangle, comes into play with problem 6 on today's assignment. So make sure you're careful as you're looking that over. Keep in mind, we right now have a half hour. In 20 minutes time, you will finish this assignment. Okay? And in that last 10 minutes, you should take that time to reread your notes, 6-1, 6-2, 6-3, 6-4, and 6-5, and do it again. In that 10-minute period, it should be enough to read it twice. If you have questions while you're reading, jot them down. We'll go over any, or you can come up to my desk and ask questions. But it should be a very, very good review / working time. For those folks that still need to take the quiz tomorrow during our PLC day, I'm setting people up to take the quiz. They've already been talked to. Make sure you show up before 7:30 for the quiz. Okay, otherwise you won't be given one. You got to be able to have time to finish it to start it. Okay. Any questions about the good of the order and what we're doing for today? One other thing, there is no retest for Chapter 6. Did I go over that? Okay, good. All right, so remember, 3 weeks. 3 weeks to make sure your grade has got a positive impact on it. Keep it up. Let's go.